Okay, the next piece I'd like to talk about is what I have listed here as our kind of our fourth breakthrough, which was developing an understanding of sequential processing. Essentially, is short-term memory and working memory. Short-term memory and working memory are typically assessed through something called a digit span. And if you were to take an IQ test, one of the things they would measure would be your auditory and visual digit spans, or your ability to sequentially process information. Generally, it's considered normal for an adult to be able to sequence 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information, which equates to listening to a 7-digit number and being able to repeat it, or looking at a 7-digit number and be able to recall it. Again, and the range is considered normal from 5 to 9. To put that in perspective, we've discovered through our work that if you're below a 7, you're in trouble. The further you are below a 7, the more trouble you're in. Okay? If you want to assess someone, what you want to do is say a sequence of numbers in a monotone at about 1-second intervals. So for example, if you're testing a 7, you'd say to them, okay, repeat this sequence, 7, 9, 8, 3, 0, 2, 5. Okay, write that down. Hopefully you were able to do that. 7, 9, 8, 3, 0, 2, 5. Okay, that's a 7. All right. Now, if I were to give you a sequence of numbers and have you repeat it backwards, that would be your reverse digit span. And essentially, your forward digit spans equates with short-term memory, which means pretty much in and out. And your ability to do it in reverse represents your working memory, which is how many pieces you can hold together and manipulate. And where you should be able to do about 7 forward, you should be able to do about 6 backwards to be okay. All right. And I say okay because part of what we worked on for a lot of years is development of sequential processing. And we have kids we work with who are in the upper teens in terms of how many numbers they can sequentially process. The higher that processing, the higher your level of function. I have a girl I recall when she was about 18 on her sequential processing, her mother taught her calculus one day. Okay. Now, to look at the other end of the spectrum, if you will, one of the very, very important pieces of the puzzle is understanding where your child's sequential processing is. Typically, a child develops the ability to sequentially process information at the rate of 1 new piece per year for the first 7 or 9 years of life, after which it tends to stop without intervention. So a 1-year-old processes 1 piece, a 2-year-old 2 pieces, a 3-year-old 3, and so forth. Okay. How many pieces your child processes is very, very important relative to their global level of function. To give you an idea of where it is, if you've got a child who cannot process 1 piece yet, and that's, if you will, a baby, all right? 1 piece auditorily would be able to have your child follow a simple direction, like you teach your child, wave, say wave bye-bye, and the child can do that, or touch your nose and they can touch their nose. That'd be processing 1 piece. Until the child can process 1 piece, they're pretty disconnected with the planet, okay? They're responding pretty much to sensory input, but they're really not thinking per se as yet, putting pieces together. When the child can process 1 piece, as in touch your nose, wave bye-bye, okay, that's a typical child is a year old, and a typical year-old child is fun and easy. Okay, a child at that level of development, you give them something, they're happy. You take it away, they don't much care, they just smile at you. Okay, they're easy, all right? And you enjoy that for about a year, and then you hit the terrible twos, okay? Well, terrible twos are terrible twos because the child processes two pieces of information. The two pieces are I want or don't want. End of discussion, okay? So that's why the twos, drive you nuts, because they're tantruming because they want something, they're tantruming because they don't want something, and you can't reason with them. You can't say, but we'll do it later. You can't process it. You got two pieces. Now, terrible twos are pretty terrible when the child is that tall and 2 years old. Terrible twos when your child's that tall and 8 years old is really terrible, okay? That processing determines global level of function. For example, I had a family come in, a new family, with an 18-year-old boy with Down syndrome. And at the time of their appointment, the mom comes in, no kid, and asks Mom, where's Jim? And she said, well, Jim's sitting in the parking lot and won't get up. And his dad's out there trying to get him up. All right. 10 minutes later, Dad got Jim in the office. Jim came in, threw a horrendous fit. Okay. Make a long story short, Jim was a 2. He was a 180-pound, 18-year-old 2. He was globally 2. All right, which meant the complexity of his thought was a 2. His language function was a 2. His interests were a 2. Okay? That's a big deal. You don't want a 180-pound 2-year-old. Right? And that sequential processing is a gargantuan piece. Now, part of what we're dealing with most of our kids within the spectrum is because of the sensory dysfunction, their brain is getting what is generally called garbage in, which produces garbage out. Development is not proceeding as it should because the brain is not receiving the necessary appropriate stimulation because it's getting garbage in. So we normalize sensory channels so we improve the quality of the input. Okay, but then we have to work at developing the sequential processing to improve the thought process and the ability to communicate. Essentially, if you think of a child, back at that 1-2, all babies stim. Okay? They rock, they discover their thumb, they suck their thumb, they rub the blanket against, okay? They're all little autistic kids. Okay? They're all stimming. And the reason they're stimming is because, number one, their sensory channels haven't developed yet. Okay? They're still broken, so they're playing with what's broken. All right? And number two, they can't process well enough to do anything else. Okay? If all you can do is rock, you know what you're going to do? You're going to rock. Okay? When they start processing two, the world starts making a little bit of sense to them, and they start paying more attention to things in the environment, start learning more from the environment, want to start exploring the environment, and you see the sensory play begin to diminish when they're at a 2. Right? When you move from the terrible 2 up into 3, it gets even a little more interesting. At a developmental level of a 3, we say the kids have lock and block behavior. When I train people, I teach them one of the most difficult kids you're ever going to try to assess is a normal 3-year-old. Because they're going to come in with their mom, and as soon as you ask them to do something, the odds are pretty good they're going to hide behind their mom, they're going to go into the chair, they're just going to lock up on you. Right? Because at 3, their processing is such that they can perceive what's going on, but not well enough to get out of their perception of something as fun or threatening. If it's fun, it's great. If they sense it's threatening, if it's work, if it's challenging, they just lock on you. So when your kids, if you've got kids and they're stuck at that 3 level, you're going to find it very interesting to do therapy with them, because if it smells like therapy, they don't want anything to do with it. Okay? If it smells like education, they don't want anything to do with it. Essentially, you have to create a non-threatening play environment, and you slip stuff in as opposed to hit them head on. When they start processing at a 4, things get a lot easier. You can start dealing with a child when they're a 4. All right? Their understanding increases. By the time they're 4, they're able to play and interact with toys and things in their environment. Now, generally, a child cannot play appropriately until they sequence a 3.
So is it more like a solitaire?
Pardon me?
Is it more like solitaire or parallel playing?
Yeah, prior to being a 3, it's not even solitary play. It's more just kind of exploring, and at a 2, it's kind of the point where the kid cruises around the house and they'll pick something up and they'll see if it'll shake or what it tastes like, and they'll throw it and they go find something else. They're not doing any kind of real directed play. Okay? It's not all stimming, it's exploration, but it's not constructive play yet. At 3, you start getting constructive play. At 4, you get imaginary play. Okay. One of the problems with the developmental process with our kids is the system was designed to change rapidly. Okay, normal development happens fast. And for a typical child, the neurological norm is change. And their brains seek change, welcome change. Slow the process down, the brain seeks homeostasis. Means the brain's happy with keeping things the same. So the longer your child is stuck, the harder it is to unstick them, because the brain wants to stay right where it is. As an example, one of the things we run across with like brain injured kids, CP kind of kids, we might put all the pieces together that would permit a child to walk. And let's say it takes 7 years to put those pieces together. It could take us 6 months or a year to get the child walking once all the pieces are there. Because that brain doesn't want to walk. Okay? And the longer your kids are at any of these developmental steps, the more stuck it tends to get. And unfortunately, the longer they're stuck, the brain tends to get too good at things. You tend not to think that you can get too good at things, but unfortunately, you can get too good at things. You can get too good at stimming, for sure. Another big part of this is a thing called visualization and conceptualization. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but essentially, babies think in pictures. And if that auditory sequential processing develops, they start thinking more in words. Stay too long thinking in pictures, you get too good at it. Which also means, by the way, if you try to test your kid's auditory sequential processing by doing what I did, have them repeat numbers, the odds are pretty good you're going to get bad data. Because the kids within the autism spectrum cheat. Okay? Because what they do is they visualize. Okay? When I said that sequence of numbers to you, hopefully there were not too many of you who pictured those numbers in your head. Okay. If you did, we'll assess you and find out why. Okay. But your kids within the spectrum where that process is slowed down visualize too well. All right, so they might be able to repeat like a 7-number sequence, but they're doing it by visualizing, not actually conceptualizing. So they take it in, they create a picture, and they read the picture. So I'll talk more about that later, but that's one of the significant issues with the kids. So they get too good at things when they get stuck at them. So the peripheral vision gets too good if they're using that too long before developing the central vision. All right. Those frequencies they're sensitive to, if they're stuck there, they tend to become more and more sensitive to frequency. So it's, the brain wants to move, the brain wants to change. And if movement doesn't happen fast enough, the brain learns to stay where it is, maintain homeostasis. Okay? So that's a biggie. By the way, when your child's kind of at that 2-3 level, and they're visualizing primarily and they're thinking, part of what happens is they become difficult to deal with because reality needs to fit the picture they have in their head. All right, so if you have any kind of routine, essentially it means your child has a video in his head of the routine. Change the routine, and you've modified the picture, and the kid can't deal with that because he can't think in words and get himself out of it. Essentially, his way of dealing with the world is having things match his pictures. Okay. So you change things so it doesn't match the picture and the kid falls apart. Okay. So visualization is, a big part of the deal with the kids. Language correlates with auditory processing. In general, children up to the age of 1, about at the time of their first birthday, will have a few words. By the end of their second birthday, when they're sequencing 2 pieces, they have functional words and couplets, and maybe throwing in a few 3-word phrases when they sequence a 2. When they sequence a 3, we're seeing 4 and 5-word sentences. When they sequence a 4, we're seeing the beginnings of conversational language. Okay. If you're trying to get your child who's a 2 to speak in sentences, good luck. Okay. You've got to get the auditory processing up before the child can hold them together in his head to produce them. Okay. We have probably spent more hours as a team discussing ways to develop sequential processing probably than almost any other issue, because it's gargantuan in terms of how important it is. Okay. Absolutely gargantuan. To give you an idea, at higher levels, I did a project for a friend of mine who has a company that makes little miniature motors that go with medical equipment and airplanes. And their requirements are, they only allowed 1 part failure per million. Okay. And these little motors are hand assembled. Okay. So if you make these little things, that's a lot of trauma and stress, all right? And he wanted me to work with his people who did assembly, and so that they would do a good job so they wouldn't have the part failure. Part of what I worked on with these adults who did this stuff was sequential processing. And when I would assess them, I would do a full academic workup and a neurodevelopmental workup. And because they were adults and we weren't working on academics, I was only watching academics kind of as a gauge in terms of what was happening neurodevelopmentally. And one of the things that became really obvious very quickly was sequential processing improved all their academic function. So I have these adults, for example, who could read but didn't read. Kind of folks who, read a newspaper once a month and didn't pick up a book and essentially didn't read. And as adults, they certainly didn't work on math. And we found that increasing their sequential processing by 1 piece changed their academic function so significantly that, like, the reading comprehension, without having read anything, could come up 2 or 3 years just by improving their processing. Their math skills would come up 2 or 3 years just by improving their processing, okay, because their brains worked better. Okay. So very, very big deal. Particularly in our case with the kids within the spectrum. The biggie is the auditory sequential processing. Visual generally is not a big issue. The auditory is a very big issue. Okay. So this is, definitely, something you want to be cognizant of and aware of, because often, you're trying to teach skills to a brain that's not ready to learn a skill or process the skill. And if you raise the processing, you discover you don't have to teach the skill. Yes, ma'am.
Give an example.
Yeah, it's everything from, let's say you're trying to teach, a process like addition. Okay? And you're trying to teach that to a child who's a 3 or a 4. All right? And you work on it, for 2 years, trying to teach the process. All right? Whereas you raise the auditory sequential processing, you can teach it in 2 minutes. Okay? It's kind of like, somebody could bring in a typical 2-year-old and say, you want to teach our 2-year-old to write. Okay? Well, we can start working on your 2-year-old to teach them to write. And probably by the time they're 5, they'll make some pretty decent letters. Just like if we started yesterday teaching them when they were developmentally ready to do it.
So are you saying it just takes time, or?
No, I'm saying that trying to educate without being cognizant of what the brain can process, you're shooting in the dark. And you're spending much too much time generally attempting to teach a skill, when if you raise the neurological level, it'd be easy. Essentially, the developmental process for a child in the autistic spectrum is no different than it is for a typical child. All right, a typical child, if you're teaching something at the correct time, it doesn't take a long time to teach it. Okay? But trying to teach that 2-year-old to write is a tough deal. Right?
So how do you increase the level?
How do you increase the level of processing? By working specifically on the processing. It's everything from, for example, if we've got a child who's processing a 1, we'll start teaching that child a whole bunch of one-step directions. And we've kind of found that a point where a child can follow about 20 or 25 one-step directions, their brain is ready to then process a 2-step direction. And we'll start teaching pairing directions. We won't teach them a sequence of 2, but we'll match sequences of 2. I say, we'd say, Johnny, touch your nose and wave bye-bye. All right, that would be a 2. You don't teach them, touch your nose and wave bye-bye. That doesn't count. All right, you just put different patterns together. When they can do 2, then you do 3. And there's, lots, it's everything from, if you get a kid who's a 3, you do things like you get a bunch of play food and you play shopping and, get me a this, a that, and a that. Right? So depending on where the child is and what the child likes to do kind of determines what you do. Older kids who are at a higher level, we have software to work on for sequential processing. But essentially, it's knowing where they are and working to get to the next step. If your data span was a 7, I'd start working on 8s. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I would say that's why one child that I know, he's great in math, but he struggles with reading. So it's a different process for reading than it is for him for math.
Yep. For math is primarily visual and visualization. Yeah. Okay, there's reasons why the kids do all the things or don't do all the things they do. And to fix it, you've got to understand that specific child, identify where their inefficiencies are, and fix the inefficiencies. It's not a matter that you keep teaching the same thing over and over again. When back in the beginning of my career, when I took over that school for United Cerebral Palsy, I'd look at the records of the kids, and I'd see this poor kid, his first year there, they taught him the letters A, B, and C, and D. At the fall of the next year, he had forgotten C and D, all right? And they started from the beginning, and 6 years later, the kid was still trying to learn the alphabet, and that was his reading program, You got to change the brains. It's taking you 6 years to teach a kid an alphabet. There's something wrong there, right? Not the least of which is you probably shouldn't have done that in the first place, but, all right. To produce significant change, you have to change the brain. Sadly, our educational system is based on a perception that you do not change brains. A child enters the system, they're tested, they're evaluated, they're classified, and the perception is that's the brain you've got to work on for the next 12 or 20 years. All right? And they attempt to teach skills to that brain as that brain walked in the door the first day. The perception is not that you can change brains. The whole definition of education functionally is essentially an attempt to teach the individual skills so they can function in the society. That's archaic, because the goal should be to provide an opportunity for the individual to achieve their innate potential and develop their neurological skills so they can function. And we do it with a whole spectrum of kids. The worst label there is average. Okay? Because the perception is, well, Johnny's doing average work because he's an average kid. Wrong. Johnny's doing average work because he hasn't been given the opportunity to neurologically develop to his potential. Most of the kids we have that we work with that are in the gifted and talented range started off as kids with learning disabilities or worse. We literally have kids that come to us as 8 and 9 in special ed, identified as having learning disabilities, and we send them to college at 14. Okay? The brain is there to be stimulated, all right? If all you're attempting to do is teach skills, you're not doing what you need to do to change the brain. Okay? So that's what this is all about. Understanding that child's brain, how it functions, where its problems are, and addressing those problems.